June 17, 1944, 05:47 hours, 3 kilometers southwest of Carentan, Normandy, France. Private Thomas Keller crouched behind a moss-covered stone wall that bisected a nameless dairy farm, his hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of the welded steel plates bolted to the front of his MG-42 machine gun. The shield was a monstrosity, a grotesque marriage of desperation and ingenuity, cobbled together from salvaged tractor parts, scrap metal torn from a destroyed barn roof, and quarter-inch steel plates liberated from a burned-out Kubelwagen 2 nights prior. He had built it himself in the flickering light of a farmer's workshop, using an acetylene torch, borrowed from a sympathetic French civilian who had long since fled, working through the night while his squad slept in the farmhouse cellar. The result was ugly, asymmetrical, 32 pounds of crude iron rectangles, fastened with mismatched bolts, angled at 30 degrees like a medieval knight's armor, grafted onto a 20th century killing machine. His squadmates had laughed when they first saw it at dawn the previous morning. Corporal Weber actually doubled over with laughter, calling it Keller's coffin lid and asking if he planned to bury himself before the Americans did it for him. Even Oberleutnant Richter, normally stoic, had permitted himself a thin smile and muttered that it violated at least 7 Wehrmacht regulations regarding the modification of standard-issue weapons. But none of them were laughing now because none of them were alive. Weber had been killed by a sniper on June 15th, shot through the throat while attempting to provide covering fire from behind a hedgerow. Richter had taken shrapnel from a mortar round the same afternoon, dying slowly over 6 hours, while calling for his mother in a Bavarian dialect Keller could barely understand. 7 men had died in 4 days trying to hold this farm against the relentless American advance, cut down the moment they exposed themselves to return fire, and Keller had no intention of becoming the 8th. The MG-42 itself was pristine, a 7.92 casing 57mm Mauser masterpiece weighing 11.57 kilograms without the improvised shield. Its barrel 533mm of chrome-lined steel capable of spitting 1,200 rounds per minute through its quick-change mechanism. Keller had requisitioned it from a destroyed Panzer IV crew 3 days earlier. Found half buried in mud beside the smouldering wreckage of the tank, the gunner's body still draped across the turret hatch, his face burned beyond recognition. The weapon had been miraculously intact, its recoil booster gleaming dully even through the mud, the belt feed mechanism unjammed, the barrel cool to the touch. It was, Keller knew, a gift from a god he no longer believed in, a final throw of the dice in a game where the house always won. The MG-42 had been designed by Werner Gruner in 1942 as a successor to the over-engineered MG-34, a weapon so complex and expensive to manufacture that German war planners had demanded something simpler, faster to produce, and more reliable under the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. The result was a machine gun that could be assembled in 45 hours compared to the MG-34's 90, used stamped sheet metal parts instead of precision machined components, and fired at a rate so ferocious that Allied soldiers called it Hitler's buzzsaw, and Soviet troops dubbed it the linoleum ripper. The sound alone was enough to break morale. A sustained ripping noise like fabric being torn at inhuman speed, a mechanical scream that announced death was coming at 1,200 rounds per minute. But doctrine demanded the MG-42 be fired from a tripod mount in sustained fire mode, or from a bipod in the light machine gun role, never from a static position without proper cover, never with improvised modifications that added 14.5 kilograms of dead weight and turned the gunner into a stationary target, visible from 300 meters. The Wehrmacht training manual, which Keller had read cover to cover during basic training in Bavaria in 1943, explicitly forbade field modifications to standard-issue weapons, stating in paragraph 17 of Section 4 that any alteration to the prescribed configuration of small arms shall be considered sabotage of military equipment and subject to court-martial. Oberleutnant Richter, before a mortar fragment had ended his concerns about regulations, had called the shield a coffin with a trigger and threatened to report Keller to the battalion commander for destruction of military property. But the battalion commander was 15 kilometers east, cut off by American advances, and Richter was dead, and the only regulation that mattered now was survival. Keller had watched 7 men die in 4 days trying to hold this farm. 7 good soldiers who had followed doctrine, who had taken proper cover, who had done everything by the book, and every single one of them had been killed within minutes of engaging the enemy. The stone walls that crisscrossed the Norman bocage offered concealment but not protection, their mortar gaps wide enough for 30 caliber rifle rounds to punch through, their height insufficient to cover a standing man, their construction too ancient to withstand modern explosives. Every defensive position they established became a grave within minutes, marked by a helmet or a boot or a spreading pool of blood soaking into the French soil. The Americans had artillery, they had air support, they had tanks and endless supplies of ammunition, and most importantly, they had momentum. They moved like a machine themselves, coordinated and relentless, clearing hedgerows and farms with textbook efficiency, and the Germans had nothing left but courage and a dwindling supply of bullets. So Keller had improvised, betting his life on quarter-inch steel plate and the hope that his farm-built monstrosity could do what doctrine could not. Keep him alive long enough to make a difference, to kill enough Americans that the ones behind them would think twice, to buy enough time for a retreat that he knew would never come. He had violated every regulation in the manual, had committed what technically constituted sabotage, had transformed a precision weapon into a hybrid abomination that no military engineer would approve. But he had also done something his training had never prepared him for. He had thought for himself, had looked at the tactical problem in front of him, and designed a solution based on observation and practical experience rather than the wisdom of staff officers who had never seen combat. The shield was angled at 30 degrees because he had calculated, using nothing but intuition and the memory of watching bullets ricochet off the Panzer-IV's armor, that a sloped surface would deflect small arms fire more effectively than a vertical plate. The viewing slit was positioned exactly 14 centimeters above the machine gun's barrel, because that gave him a clear line of sight while minimizing his exposure. The bolts were countersunk and filed smooth because protruding bolt heads could catch on equipment or create weak points where bullets might punch through. Every detail had been considered, every modification made with purpose, and if it was ugly and crude and violated 7 different regulations, it was also functional, and functionality was the only currency that mattered in Normandy in June 1944. At 05:48 hours, as morning mist clung to the hedgerows like a living thing, and the first light of dawn painted the bocage in shades of gold and shadow, Keller heard the unmistakable sound of boots on wet grass, dozens of them, moving with the disciplined cadence of assault troops who had done this 100 times before. He pressed his eye to the crude viewing slit he had cut into the shield with a cold chisel and a hammer, his finger resting lightly on the MG-42's trigger, and waited. The viewing slit was narrow, barely 4 centimeters wide and 2 centimeters tall, just enough to see the pasture in front of him, but not enough to provide a clear target for enemy marksmen. Through it, he could see the stone wall 40 meters ahead, the abandoned barn to his left with its collapsed roof and burned timbers, the hedgerow that marked the eastern boundary of the property, and beyond that, movement. Shadows in the mist, human-shaped but indistinct, advancing in a staggered line that spoke of professional training and combat experience. These were not conscripts or green replacements. These were veterans, men who understood how to use terrain, how to move under fire, how to kill efficiently and without hesitation. Keller's breath came shallow and quick, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, but his hands remained steady on the MG-42's pistol grip and cocking handle. The laughter of his squadmates echoed in his memory. Weber's wheezing guffaw, the younger soldiers' snickers, the dismissive comments about the farm boy and his tractor parts. But that laughter was about to be drowned out by 1,200 rounds per minute of vindication, by the sustained mechanical scream of the MG-42 in full automatic, by the proof that sometimes desperation and ingenuity were worth more than doctrine and regulations. The farm had been German-held for 11 days, a strategic choke point on the road network between Carentan and Saint-Lô, controlling access to 3 separate routes that the Americans needed for their advance inland from the beaches. It was not marked on most maps, had no official designation, was simply referred to as the dairy farm in radio communications, but its position made it invaluable. From the second floor of the farmhouse, now reduced to rubble by American artillery, An observer could see for kilometers in 3 directions. The road that ran past the southern wall was wide enough for armor, one of the few in the bocage that could support the weight of Sherman tanks, and whoever controlled that road controlled the pace of the American advance. Keller's squad, originally 12 men under Oberleutnant Richter's command, had been ordered to hold the position until reinforcements arrived from the east, from the scattered remnants of the German divisions that had been retreating in disorder since the Allied landings on June 6th. Those reinforcements, Keller knew with absolute certainty, were a fiction, a comforting lie whispered by officers who had already packed their maps and binoculars and were planning their own escapes. The German army in Normandy was disintegrating, not through lack of courage but through mathematics, through the simple arithmetic of men and machines and ammunition. The Allies had more of everything, and no amount of tactical brilliance or individual heroism could overcome that fundamental imbalance. But orders were orders, and until someone countermanded them, or until the Americans overran the position, Keller's job was to hold the farm. He was now the only machine gunner left in a squad, reduced to 4 effectives, 4 men who huddled in the farmhouse cellar and pretended they believed the reinforcements were coming. Through the mist, Keller could now make out the details of the first wave, 28 soldiers moving in a staggered line across the pasture, their rifles at low ready, their movements cautious but relentless, their uniforms dark with moisture from crawling through the wet grass. They wore the distinctive helmets of American paratroopers, which meant these were almost certainly men from the 101st Airborne, veterans of the drop on D-Day, soldiers who had survived the chaos of the initial landings and fought their way inland through some of the bloodiest combat of the campaign. They had done this before, cleared farms like this 100 times, and they knew the rhythm of it. Suppressive fire on suspected positions, advance by fire and movement with one element covering while another moved, flank the machine gun nest using terrain and speed, close to grenade range, destroy the position with high explosives and small arms fire, consolidate and move on to the next objective. It was doctrine, American doctrine, and it was effective because it was based on overwhelming firepower and aggressive assault rather than static defense. Keller had watched them do it 3 times in the past 4 days, had seen them reduce German positions that should have held for hours in a matter of minutes, had witnessed the terrible efficiency of their combined arms tactics. But this time would be different, he told himself. This time he had the shield, had the MG-42, had a plan that violated every rule he had been taught but made perfect sense in the cold calculus of survival. His hands steadied as he adjusted his grip on the MG-42's pistol grip and cocking handle, the weapon's recoil booster gleaming dully in the half-light. Its quick-change barrel locked into position with a satisfying click he had checked 3 times already. The belt feed was loaded with a 250-round belt of 7.92 x-57mm Mauser ammunition, ball rounds interspersed with tracers in a 4-to-1 ratio, enough for sustained fire if he managed it correctly, if he didn't let the barrel overheat, if he controlled his bursts and made every round count. The MG-42 could fire 1,200 rounds per minute, but that was cyclic rate, the theoretical maximum that assumed perfect conditions and unlimited ammunition. In practice, Keller knew he needed to fire in bursts of 5 to 7 seconds, no more, to prevent barrel wear and conserve ammunition. 7 seconds at 1,200 rounds per minute meant roughly 140 rounds per burst, which meant his 250-round belt would last less than 2 bursts if he wasn't careful. He had 3 more belts stored in the ammunition cans behind him, 750 rounds total, which sounded like a lot until you did the mathematics and realized it represented less than 40 seconds of sustained fire. Every bullet had to count. Every burst had to be aimed. There was no room for panic or spray-and-pray tactics. This was not a John Wayne movie. This was mathematics, trigonometry, the cold calculus of angles and trajectories, of muzzle velocity and bullet drop, and the ballistic properties of steel-cored 7.92mm projectiles traveling at 762 meters per second. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his breathing slowed, the way his father had taught him to breathe when aiming a hunting rifle at a wild boar in the Bavarian forests 15 years ago, when Keller had been 11 years old, and the world had been a place where wars were stories in history books, and the greatest concern in his life was whether he would be allowed to carry his father's rifle on the next hunt. That world was gone now, burned away in the fires of ideology and conquest, and the boy who had worried about hunting privileges was gone too, replaced by a 26-year-old soldier who had killed 11 men that he knew of, and possibly more that he didn't, who had seen friends die in ways that would give him nightmares for whatever life he had left, who had learned that survival was not about courage or honor, but about making the right decisions in the 2 seconds you had before the bullets started flying. This was different from hunting, he knew. This was not about stalking prey or testing skill. This was about killing human beings, men with families and futures and dreams, men who probably didn't want to be here any more than he did, men who were following orders just like he was. But that knowledge, while true, was also useless. Philosophy and moral qualms were luxuries for peacetime. Right now, in this moment, with 28 American soldiers advancing across the pasture toward his position, the only thing that mattered was the MG-42 and the shield, and whether his farm-built gamble would work. The Americans were 150 meters out now, close enough for him to see individual details. The mud on their boots, the way the lead soldier gestured with his left hand while keeping his rifle ready with his right, the careful spacing between the men that minimized casualties from grenades or machine gun fire, the professional crouch that kept their silhouettes low while maintaining mobility. They moved in pairs, covering each other with textbook precision, one man advancing while his partner remained stationary and ready to provide suppressive fire. It was beautiful in its efficiency, a deadly ballet choreographed by someone who understood infantry tactics at a fundamental level. Keller felt a strange respect for these men, these enemies who were coming to kill him, because they were clearly good at their jobs, and there was a certain professional appreciation in recognizing skill even in an adversary. But respect wouldn't save him. Admiration wouldn't stop bullets. The only thing that would keep him alive was the MG-42 and his ability to use it effectively, to turn this pasture into a killing ground before they could close the distance and flank his position. His thumb flicked the safety off with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet morning. The MG-42 was ready. He was ready. And in 6 minutes, the pasture would become a graveyard, and the story of Thomas Keller and his farm-built shield would become legend or footnote, depending on who survived to tell it. Bloco 2, Conflito, Ação Plus, Tensão Técnica, 3,000 palavras. At 05:49 hours, when the lead American soldier reached the 120-meter mark, Keller squeezed the trigger. The MG-42 erupted with a sound that defied description, not the rhythmic chatter of conventional machine guns, but a continuous tearing roar that seemed to rip the air itself apart. 1,200 rounds per minute, translating to 20 rounds per second, so fast that individual shots blurred into a sustained mechanical scream. The recoil slammed against the improvised shield, 32 pounds of welded steel absorbing kinetic energy that would have torn the weapon from Keller's hands, the bolted plates rattling but holding firm as the MG-42 cycled through its first burst. Tracers arced across the pasture in flat trajectories, every fifth round burning bright orange in the morning mist, marking the path of the invisible bullets between them like a malevolent constellation. The 7.92mm rounds hit the lead American in the chest, 3 of them in less than a quarter second, the impact lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward into the wet grass as if yanked by invisible cables. His partner dove left, seeking cover behind a low rise in the terrain, but Keller had already adjusted his aim, the MG-42's sight picture tracking smoothly as he walked the burst across the pasture. 2 more Americans went down, one clutching his leg and screaming, the other silent and still. The entire first burst lasted 6 seconds and consumed approximately 120 rounds, leaving Keller's 250-round belt half empty and the MG-42's barrel already beginning to heat, the chrome lining conducting thermal energy that made the air above the weapon shimmer. The Americans reacted with the speed of professional soldiers, dropping prone and returning fire within 3 seconds of the first burst, their M1 Garands and Thompson submachine guns crackling in response. Bullets struck Keller's shield with sharp metallic cracks, some ricocheting at wild angles as they hit the 30-degree slope of the welded plates, others punching small dents into the quarter-inch steel but not penetrating. One round found the narrow viewing slit, passing through the 4-centimeter gap so close to Keller's face that he felt the pressure wave and heard the supersonic crack, the bullet missing his left eye by perhaps 2 centimeters before burying itself in the stone wall behind him. His hands trembled but held steady on the pistol grip, his breathing ragged but controlled, and he forced himself to wait, to let the Americans commit to their positions, to give them 3 seconds of hope that their suppressive fire was working. Then he squeezed the trigger again, this time in shorter bursts, 3-second pulses that sent 75 rounds downrange with each squeeze, the MG-42's barrel glowing dully even in the dawn light. An American who had been crawling toward the stone wall 40 meters away jerked and went still, his helmet rolling free. Another attempted to sprint for the hedgerow on the left flank and made it 4 steps before the tracers found him, the bullets stitching across his torso in a diagonal line that was clinically precise and absolutely lethal. The mathematics of the engagement were brutally simple. The MG-42 fired 20 rounds per second at a muzzle velocity of 762 meters per second, which meant that at 120 meters range, there was approximately 0.16 seconds of flight time between trigger squeeze and impact. The Americans, even moving at a dead sprint, could cover perhaps 8 meters per second, which meant Keller's bullets reached them in the time it took them to move 1.3 meters. They were not fighting a man. They were fighting physics, chemistry, the metallurgical properties of chrome-lined steel and brass-jacketed lead, and physics always won. But the Americans were not without resources, and they were not stupid. Keller saw hand signals flashing between the survivors, saw 3 men break right, while 2 others provided covering fire, saw the classic flanking maneuver developing exactly as Wehrmacht doctrine predicted it would. The problem was that doctrine also said the machine gunner should displace after the first burst, should relocate to a secondary position before the enemy could coordinate fire on his location, and Keller could not do that because the improvised shield weighed 14.5 kilograms and the MG-42 weighed 11.57 kilograms, and moving 26 kilograms of equipment under fire was a good way to die instantly. So he did what doctrine said was impossible. He held his ground, trusted his farm-built armor, and rotated his aim to engage the flanking element. The 3 Americans moving right were using a shallow drainage ditch for cover, low-crawling through mud and grass, with their weapons cradled in their elbows, moving fast enough to close the distance, but slow enough to stay concealed. They were good, disciplined, experienced, and in another 30 seconds they would be at an angle where they could shoot past Keller's shield and hit him from the side where he was unprotected. He waited until the first man raised his head to check his position, just a 2-second glimpse of helmet and forehead above the ditch line, and unleashed a 5-second burst that tore through the grass and dirt along the ditch's edge. The MG-42's cyclic rate meant that 5 seconds of fire put 100 rounds into a space roughly 3 meters long and 1 meter wide, a density of projectiles that turned earth and vegetation into a blender of supersonic metal. The helmet disappeared back into the ditch, but Keller saw the spray of red mist that accompanied it, saw the way the grass suddenly stopped moving where the second soldier had been crawling. The third man in the flanking element, showing either courage or desperation, rose to his knees and threw a grenade, a Mark II fragmentation grenade that Keller recognized by its distinctive pineapple shape, even as it arced through the air toward his position. He had perhaps 2 seconds to react. Not enough time to move, not enough time to do anything but watch the grenade tumble end over end in a lazy parabola that would bring it down almost exactly where he was crouched. It struck the top of the stone wall 2 meters to his left, bounced once on the whetstone, and detonated with a flat crack that sent shrapnel whining through the air. Keller felt the impacts on his shield, heard the metallic pings of steel fragments striking steel plate, felt one piece tear through his left sleeve and gouge a burning line across his forearm without fully penetrating. The shield had saved him again, the angled plates deflecting most of the shrapnel upward and away, but his ears rang with the overpressure, and his vision swam with adrenaline and shock. He blinked hard, forced his eyes to focus, and found the soldier who had thrown the grenade still kneeling in the ditch, frozen in the follow-through of his throw, perhaps stunned that his target was still alive. Keller put a 3-second burst into him, 60 rounds that obliterated the kneeling figure, and turned the drainage ditch into a trench filled with things that had been human moments before. His first ammunition belt ran dry with a mechanical click, the belt feed powel striking empty air, and Keller's hands moved with the automatic precision of training, releasing the feed tray cover, yanking the spent belt free, grabbing the second belt from the ammunition can behind him, loading the first round into the feed mechanism, slamming the cover closed, cycling the action, all of it taking perhaps 8 seconds, during which the remaining Americans poured fire into his position with renewed intensity. Bullets struck his shield in a steady drumbeat of impacts, 30 caliber M1 rounds and 45 caliber Thompson rounds, none of them penetrating but each one adding a new dent or scratch or stress point to the welded steel. A round hit the edge of his viewing slit and deformed the metal, reducing his field of view by a third, turning the narrow opening into a ragged scar that made it harder to aim but was still functional. Another bullet struck the MG-42's barrel shroud and ricocheted off with a sound like a hammer striking an anvil, leaving a bright scratch in the blued steel but causing no functional damage. The weapon was built to withstand abuse, designed to function in mud and sand and snow and rain, and a few bullets striking non-critical components were not going to stop it. Keller brought the reloaded weapon to bear and swept the pasture methodically, left to right, engaging any target that presented itself, prioritizing the soldiers who were still mobile over those who were already wounded or taking cover. The MG-42's sustained fire rate, accounting for barrel changes and reloading, was supposed to be around 150 rounds per minute, according to Wehrmacht doctrine. But doctrine assumed a crew of 3 men and tactical fire discipline and breaks between engagements. Keller was alone, had no time for discipline, and had no intention of stopping until every threat was neutralized, or he ran out of ammunition, or the weapon failed. He fired in bursts that varied between 3 and 7 seconds, each burst consuming between 60 and 140 rounds, the expenditure rate so high that his second belt lasted less than 45 seconds. 7 more Americans went down in that 45 seconds, some killed instantly, others wounded badly enough that they stopped being threats, all of them added to the butcher's bill that was accumulating in the Norman pasture. The wet grass was littered with bodies now, 14 men down in under 3 minutes, and the survivors were beginning to break, the cohesion of their assault dissolving under the sustained mechanical violence of the MG-42's fire. Keller could see it in their movements, the way they were no longer advancing but simply trying to survive, the way they were crawling backward toward the hedgerow they had emerged from, the way their return fire was becoming sporadic and poorly aimed. They had expected resistance, had planned for a machine gun nest, but they had not expected this, had not expected a single gunner to hold his ground and maintain such a devastating rate of fire while absorbing everything they threw at him. But Keller's situation was deteriorating rapidly in ways that had nothing to do with enemy action. The MG-42's barrel was now glowing cherry red, visible even in the growing daylight, heated to temperatures approaching 600 degrees Celsius by the friction of 350 rounds passing through it in under 2 minutes. The weapon's quick-change barrel system was designed precisely for this problem, allowing a gunner to swap out an overheated barrel in under 6 seconds, but that assumed the gunner had a spare barrel and the time to perform the swap without being shot. Keller had neither. His only spare barrel was in the farmhouse cellar, left behind because carrying it would have added another 2 kilograms to the shield assembly, and he certainly couldn't swap barrels now, with half a dozen Americans still shooting at him. So he did what doctrine said would destroy the weapon. He kept firing, trusting the chrome lining to hold, knowing he was reducing the barrel's service life from approximately 15,000 rounds to perhaps 500, but not caring because service life was measured in peacetime, and this was war, and the only thing that mattered was the next 30 seconds. The barrel's heat was now so intense that the wooden furniture on the MG-42's forend was beginning to smoke, thin wisps of grey vapor rising from the walnut handguard, the varnish bubbling and darkening. Keller ignored it, adjusted his grip to avoid the hot metal, and kept shooting. His third ammunition belt, loaded and fired in the same frenzy of mechanical action and recoil, lasted even less time than the second because he was now firing longer bursts, 8 and 9 second pulses, that put 160 to 180 rounds downrange with each trigger squeeze, accuracy degrading as the overheated barrel began to warp microscopically, but volume of fire compensating for precision. An American machine gunner, apparently brought forward to suppress Keller's position, set up a Browning M1919 behind the stone wall 40 meters away and managed to fire a 10-round burst before Keller's return fire found him, the MG-42's superior rate of fire overwhelming the Browning's 500 rounds per minute cyclic rate. The American gunner slumped over his weapon, and the M1919 went silent, and Keller felt no triumph, only the grim satisfaction of having solved a tactical problem before it killed him. Another grenade came in, this one better thrown, landing just in front of his position, and detonating close enough that the overpressure wave made his ears bleed, thin trickles of blood running down both sides of his neck. The shrapnel tore into his shield with renewed fury, punching through one of the thinner plates and sending a fragment into his right thigh, a burning lance of pain that made him gasp but didn't stop him from firing. The wound was superficial, he thought, or at least not immediately fatal. And immediately fatal was the only category that mattered right now. Everything else could be dealt with later, if there was a later. At 0553 hours, 4 minutes into the engagement, Keller's fourth and final ammunition belt clicked into the MG-42's feed mechanism, 250 rounds of 7.92-meter brass and lead, all that stood between him and empty guns. He had fired 750 rounds in 4 minutes, an average of 187 rounds per minute, far exceeding the sustained fire rate but well below the cyclic rate, the human middle ground between doctrine and desperation. The barrel was now glowing bright orange, the chrome lining probably damaged beyond repair. The weapon's accuracy reduced to point in general direction and hope, but it was still functioning, still cycling, still sending bullets down range with lethal effect. The Americans were falling back now in earnest. 10 men down, another 5 wounded, only a dozen still combat effective, and those 12 were retreating toward the hedgerow with the disciplined covering fire of soldiers who knew they were beaten but refused to panic. Keller tracked them with his sights, fired controlled bursts that kicked up dirt and grass around the retreating figures, and then he saw something that made his blood freeze. A radio operator, crouched behind the hedgerow, speaking urgently into a hand microphone while pointing toward Keller's position. The operator was calling in artillery or mortars or air support, was bringing to bear the overwhelming firepower advantage that the Americans possessed, and Keller knew with absolute certainty that he had perhaps 2 minutes before high explosives started raining down on his position. 2 minutes to finish this, to break the assault completely, to inflict enough casualties that the Americans would think twice about the next farm, the next stone wall, the next desperate German soldier with an MG-42. He elevated his aim slightly and fired a sustained burst at the hedgerow, not aiming at specific targets but saturating the area. 20 seconds of continuous fire that consumed 400 rounds and reduced his final belt to empty in a mechanical frenzy that represented everything doctrine warned against and everything survival demanded. The MG-42's barrel was now white-hot, literally glowing like a forge, the heat so intense that the paint on the receiver was bubbling and peeling, the smell of burning metal and wood filling his nostrils. The weapon was dying, killing itself through thermal stress and mechanical fatigue, but it was still firing, still cycling, still functioning through sheer German engineering and Keller's desperate will. The hedgerow erupted in a storm of shredded vegetation and screams, the sustained fire finding targets that Keller couldn't even see, the sheer volume of bullets making concealment irrelevant. When the belt ran empty and the MG-42's bolt locked back on an empty chamber, the silence that followed was so profound that Keller thought for a moment he had gone deaf. But then he heard the moaning of the wounded, the rustle of the survivors retreating through the hedgerow, and his own ragged breathing, and he knew it was over. 6 minutes, 1,000 rounds. 27 American soldiers down, killed or wounded so badly they were out of the fight, and Thomas Keller was still alive, behind his farm-built shield, with an MG-42 that was probably ruined, but had done its job, had proven that sometimes desperation and ingenuity were worth more than all the doctrine in the world. Block 03's Resolução. Clímax. Resultado contábil. 3,000 palavras. The silence after the MG-42's bolt locked back was not peaceful, but pregnant with violence yet to come. The kind of quiet that preceded artillery barrages and airstrikes, the momentary breath before industrial warfare resumed its grinding machinery. Keller remained frozen behind his shield for 3 seconds, then 5. His hands still gripping the superheated pistol grip through his gloves, his finger still on the trigger of a weapon that had nothing left to give. The MG-42's barrel was ruined. He knew that without inspection, the chrome lining almost certainly cracked or melted. The rifling degraded to the point where accuracy would be measured in meters rather than centimeters. White smoke rose from the receiver, where lubricating oil had vaporized, and the smell of overheated metal mixed with cordite and blood and wet grass created an olfactory signature that would stay with him for whatever life remained. His ears rang with tinnitus so severe that all sound seemed to come from underwater, muffled and distorted, and thin streams of blood still trickled from both ear canals where the overpressure from grenades and sustained fire had ruptured something delicate and irreplaceable. The wound in his right thigh throbbed with each heartbeat, his trouser leg soaked dark with blood. But when he risked a glance down, he saw that the fragment had missed the femoral artery, had torn through muscle and flesh without hitting anything immediately fatal. He would live probably if infection didn't set in, if he didn't bleed out over the next hour, if American artillery didn't reduce his position to a crater in the next 5 minutes. Slowly, moving with the exaggerated care of a man who expected bullets to resume their flight at any moment, Keller raised his head above the shield and looked at what he had done. The pasture was a slaughterhouse, bodies scattered across 120 meters of wet grass in configurations that spoke of violent death and final moments of agony. The nearest American lay 15 meters away, face down, his uniform dark with blood, one hand still outstretched toward a rifle he would never reach. Beyond him, 2 more bodies lay tangled together where they had fallen while attempting to drag each other to cover, the mathematics of friendship and duty ending in mutual destruction. The drainage ditch where the flanking element had attempted their maneuver was no longer visible as a tactical feature, but as a grave, 3 bodies crumpled in positions that defied comfortable description. Near the stone wall, the American machine gunner still draped over his Browning M1919. His weapon unfired except for that initial 10-round burst, his war ended by superior rate of fire and bad luck. Keller counted methodically, his mind retreating into the comfort of numbers and quantification as a defense against the horror of what he was seeing. 1, 2, 3, continuing across the field in a grim census that tallied 14 men clearly dead, their stillness absolute and final, and another 8 wounded badly enough that they were not moving, were either unconscious or in shock or simply beyond caring. 22 casualties visible from his position, and he had seen at least 5 more go down during the final sustained burst into the hedgerow. Men who had been dragged away by their retreating comrades, or who had crawled into concealment to die alone. 27 total, the number fixed itself in his mind with crystalline clarity. 27 American soldiers killed or wounded in 6 minutes by 1 German private with a farm-built shield and an MG-42 fired far beyond its design specifications. The mathematics of it were staggering when considered objectively, stripped of emotion and moral weight and reduced to pure arithmetic. 27 casualties from approximately 1,000 rounds fired meant a hit rate of 2.7%, which sounded low until you understood that most of those rounds had been suppressive fire, area saturation intended to deny movement rather than achieve precision kills. The 14 confirmed dead from 1,000 rounds meant 71 rounds expended per fatality, which was actually remarkably efficient compared to standard infantry combat, where expenditure rates of 10,000 rounds per kill were not uncommon. The MG-42's cyclic rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, sustained across 6 minutes, should have consumed 7,200 rounds. But Keller's actual expenditure of 1,000 rounds represented a tactical firing rate of 167 rounds per minute, a human-sustainable middle ground between the weapon's theoretical maximum and Wehrmacht doctrine's recommended sustained rate of 150 rounds per minute. He had pushed the weapon to its absolute limits, had violated every guideline about barrel temperature and sustained fire, and the MG42 had performed flawlessly until the final round, had functioned exactly as Werner Gruner's engineers had designed it to function, simple and reliable and devastatingly effective. The improvised shield had absorbed approximately 40 direct hits from rifle fire, 3 near misses from grenades, and countless fragments of shrapnel, and while it was now dented and scarred and had one plate with a hole punched completely through, it had kept Keller alive through an engagement that should have killed him in the first 30 seconds. 32 pounds of farm scrap and tractor parts had proven more valuable than all the tactical doctrine in the Wehrmacht manual. But the butcher's bill was not complete, and Keller knew it as he watched the hedgerow where the Americans had retreated. He could hear voices there, urgent and pained, the sound of men calling for medics and organizing casualty evacuation, the normal sounds of a military unit trying to save its wounded and regroup after a failed assault. Part of him, the part that had been raised in a Bavarian village where neighbors helped neighbors and human life had value beyond tactical considerations, wanted to call out to them, to offer some kind of ceasefire so they could collect their dead and wounded without further violence. But another part, the part that had been forged in 4 years of war and countless engagements, knew that mercy was a luxury he could not afford, that the moment he revealed he was out of ammunition or that his weapon was damaged, they would resume the assault and overrun his position within minutes. So he remained silent, maintained the illusion of combat effectiveness, kept his hands on the MG42's grips as if ready to fire again, and hoped they could not see that the barrel was white-hot and warped, or that his ammunition cans were empty, or that he was bleeding from half a dozen wounds. The deception held for 2 minutes, then 3, and then he heard the sound he had been dreading. The whistle of incoming artillery, high-pitched and rising, the acoustic signature of 105mm shells in flight. The first round impacted 70 meters short, in the pasture where most of the American casualties lay, the explosion sending up a geyser of earth and grass and things that had been human. Keller ducked behind his shield reflexively, though he knew it would offer zero protection against high explosives, knew that artillery fire was not something you could armor against with farm scrap and quarter-inch steel. The second round hit closer, 40 meters away, the shockwave strong enough to make his teeth rattle and his vision blur. The third round struck the stone wall to his left, pulverizing 200-year-old masonry into gravel and shrapnel, fragments whistling past his position close enough that he felt them disturb the air. This was not precision fire intended to support an assault, but area bombardment intended to obliterate everything in the target zone, the American solution to the problem of Thomas Keller and his MG42. If you cannot flank it, cannot suppress it, cannot kill the gunner with small arms, you bring to bear the industrial capacity of the American war machine and erase the position from existence. Keller had perhaps 30 seconds before the artillery battery found the proper range, before a 105mm shell landed directly on his position and turned him into a pink mist mixed with French soil. He made the only decision possible, the same decision that had kept him alive for 4 years. He ran. Abandoning the MG42 was like cutting off a limb, a physical pain that went beyond tactical considerations into something almost spiritual. But the weapon was ruined anyway, and weighed too much to carry, and would mark him as a target the moment he tried to move with it. He left it behind the shield, left the empty ammunition cans and the spent brass casings and the improvised armor that had saved his life, and he ran in a crouch toward the farmhouse cellar where the 4 remaining members of his squad were huddled. Artillery rounds walked across the farm in a systematic pattern, each explosion closer than the last. The American forward observer having finally gotten accurate coordinates and now adjusting fire with professional precision. Keller covered 30 meters in perhaps 8 seconds, moving faster than he had thought possible with a leg wound, adrenaline and terror overriding pain and fatigue. He dove through the cellar entrance just as a 105mm round impacted where he had been standing 2 seconds earlier, the explosion collapsing part of the stone wall and burying his position under tons of rubble. The shield, the MG42, the ammunition cans, all of it vanished under rock and earth, entombed like an archaeological artifact, waiting for future historians to excavate and wonder at. In the cellar, illuminated by a single oil lamp, the 4 surviving soldiers stared at him with expressions mixing relief and disbelief. Corporal Fisher, who had assumed command after Richter's death, grabbed Keller by the shoulders and shook him, half embrace and half examination to confirm he was real and alive. "How many?" Fisher asked, his voice hoarse with smoke inhalation and stress. "How many did you get?" Keller's throat was dry, his voice when it came barely above a whisper, but the number was clear. 27, maybe more. "I counted 27. Fisher's eyes widened, and the other soldiers exchanged glances that conveyed skepticism and awe in equal measure. 27 casualties from a single defensive position was the kind of number that appeared in propaganda reports or exaggerated war stories, not in actual combat, where most engagements were confused and inconclusive. But the artillery fire raining down above them, the intensity of it, the sheer volume of high explosives being expended to neutralize one position, suggested that the Americans believed the threat was real and substantial. You did not call in a full battery fire mission on a trivial target. You did not expend dozens of 105mm shells on a position that had killed 1 or 2 men. The American response was proportional to the damage Keller had inflicted, was confirmation by fire and fury that something extraordinary had happened in that pasture. Fisher pulled a field dressing from his pack and began wrapping Keller's thigh wound, the bandage immediately soaking through with blood, but at least providing pressure and some hope of controlling the bleeding. Another soldier, Private Zimmerman, offered a canteen of water that tasted like rust and salvation, and Keller drank half of it in desperate gulps before forcing himself to stop and conserve the rest. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline draining away and leaving behind exhaustion so profound it felt like gravity had doubled. Fisher asked the question that Keller had been avoiding asking himself. "Can you walk? We need to evacuate. The Americans will assault again once the artillery stops, and we cannot hold this position with 4 effectives and no machine gun." Keller tested his leg, putting weight on it gingerly, and found that while it hurt with a deep throbbing agony that made him nauseous, it was functional. The fragment had missed bone and major blood vessels, had carved a channel through muscle that would scar badly, but was not immediately crippling. "I can walk," he confirmed, his voice gaining strength. "How long until we move?" Fisher checked his watch, calculated odds and distances, and the likely timing of the American assault. 10 minutes. We move east toward the rally point. Hope we can link up with whoever is left of the battalion. The farm is lost. But you held them, Keller. You held them long enough for battalion to evacuate 3 kilometers of front line. Command radioed 20 minutes ago. Said they needed 1 more hour of delay, but you gave them that in 6 minutes. 27 Americans, with a farm-built shield they all laughed at. The number would stay with Keller for the rest of his life, would become a marker that divided his existence into before and after. 27 men, killed or wounded by his hand in 6 minutes of sustained violence that had seemed to last hours. 27 fathers, brothers, sons, removed from the world by German engineering and his own desperate ingenuity. He felt no pride in it, no triumph, only a vast emptiness and the knowledge that he had done what was necessary to survive, what any soldier in his position would have done. The Americans would come again, would take the farm eventually because they had more men and more ammunition and more of everything, but they would remember the cost, would approach the next stone wall with caution, would hesitate for just a moment before assaulting the next position. And in a war of attrition, hesitation and caution bought time, and time was the only resource the German army had left. Fisher helped Keller to his feet, and the 5 survivors of the original 12-man squad prepared to evacuate, grabbing essential equipment and abandoning everything else. Above them, the artillery fire continued its methodical destruction of the farm, each explosion adding to the archaeological layer of violence that was being written into Norman soil. Somewhere under that rubble, buried beneath stone and earth, was the MG-42 with its ruined barrel and the farm-built shield with its dents and scars, physical evidence of the day Thomas Keller had held an impossible position and proven that sometimes ingenuity and desperation could defeat doctrine and overwhelming force. 27 casualties, 6 minutes. 1 soldier with a weapon everyone said would fail, and armor everyone said was suicide. The mathematics of survival, written in brass casings and blood. Bloco 4, legado, reflexão plus comunidade plus sitia. 3.000 palavras. Thomas Keller survived the war, though the man who walked away from the Normandy farm in June 1944 bore little resemblance to the boy who had left Bavaria in 1940, believing in glory and national destiny. He carried the leg wound for the rest of his life, a puckered scar on his right thigh that ached in cold weather, and served as a physical reminder of the day he had killed 27 men with a weapon everyone said would fail, and armor everyone said was suicide. The tinnitus never fully resolved, leaving him with a constant high-pitched ringing that made quiet moments uncomfortable and sleep difficult. The permanent acoustic signature of 1,200 rounds per minute, fired in sustained bursts that violated every safety guideline. But he carried other wounds too, invisible ones that no field dressing could treat and no doctor could diagnose in 1944, the psychological freight of having looked through a crude viewing slit and systematically ended human lives with mechanical efficiency. He spoke rarely of the engagement, and when he did, it was in the clipped factual language of after-action reports, grid coordinates, ammunition expenditure, casualty counts, the vocabulary of violence stripped of emotion and context. His children, born in the 1950s when Germany was rebuilding and trying desperately to forget, knew their father had fought in the war, but knew few details beyond that vague acknowledgement. The farm-built shield was never recovered, buried under rubble and earth and eventually paved over when the French government modernized the road network in the 1960s. The MG-42, with its ruined barrel, remained entombed somewhere beneath what became a commercial dairy operation, its precise location lost to time and reconstruction. No monument marked the pasture where 27 American soldiers had fallen. No plaque commemorated Thomas Keller's desperate stand. The farm simply returned to its agricultural function, producing milk and cheese, the ground fertilized by the blood of men whose names appeared on memorials in Iowa and Texas and Massachusetts, but whose deaths in that specific location were recorded only in unit histories and casualty reports that few civilians would ever read. The American unit that had assaulted the farm was identified years later through records research as Company B, 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, veterans of the D-Day jump who had fought their way through some of the heaviest combat in Normandy. Their after-action report, declassified in the 1970s, made brief mention of intense machine gun fire from prepared position and noted casualties of 14 killed and 13 wounded during an engagement on June 17, 1944, near Carentan. The report's clinical language gave no sense of the terror or chaos, made no mention of the shield or the single gunner or the sustained rate of fire that had broken their assault. It was simply recorded as one more failed attack in a campaign full of them, one more position that had cost American lives before eventually being neutralized by artillery. The individual casualties were listed by name and rank in a separate document. Private First Class James Morrison of Des Moines, killed in action. Corporal Robert Chen of San Francisco died of wounds. Sergeant William O'Malley of Boston, wounded and evacuated. 27 names attached to 27 stories. 27 families who received telegrams and folded flags and the cold comfort that their sons and husbands and fathers had died in service to their country. None of those families ever knew the specific circumstances of those deaths, never knew about Thomas Keller or his farm-built shield or the 6 minutes that had changed so many lives irrevocably. The official narrative was simply that they had fallen in France during the liberation, which was true but incomplete. The way all official narratives are incomplete when they try to compress human tragedy into bureaucratic language. Keller's own military records, preserved in German archives, contained even less detail. His personnel file noted that he had been awarded the Iron Cross Second Class in July 1944 for exceptional valor in defensive operations near Carentan, the citation signed by a battalion commander who had never witnessed the engagement but had read Fisher's report and understood that something extraordinary had occurred. The decoration was presented in a brief ceremony at a field hospital where Keller was recovering from his wounds, the ribbon pinned to his hospital gown by an officer who shook his hand and moved on to the next recipient. One more routine acknowledgement in a war producing thousands of decorations for thousands of acts of courage and desperation. Keller never wore the medal after the war, kept it in a drawer with his discharge papers and other artifacts of a period he preferred not to revisit. When he died in 1989 at the age of 71, The Iron Cross was found among his effects by his daughter, who had never seen it before and had no context for understanding what it represented. She donated it to a local museum along with his other military memorabilia, where it sits today in a display case alongside dozens of other medals and badges, anonymous and unexplained, one more fragment of history waiting for someone to ask the right questions. The tactical lessons of Keller's defense were never formally incorporated into Wehrmacht doctrine because by June 1944, the German military was in no position to analyze and disseminate tactical innovations. The shield concept, improvised and effective, died with the specific circumstances that created it, never replicated or studied or improved upon. Post-war military historians, when they examined defensive tactics in Normandy, focused on larger engagements and strategic decisions, rarely drilling down to the level of individual positions or soldiers. The few accounts that mentioned machine gun defenses in the bocage treated them as generic tactical problems solved by American firepower and maneuver, not as specific engagements where individual ingenuity had played a decisive role. Keller's defense became a ghost in the historical record, present in fragmentary mentions and casualty statistics, but absent from the narratives that shaped public understanding of the campaign. It was not unique in this regard. Thousands of similar engagements, small unit actions where individuals made split-second decisions that affected outcomes, vanished into archival obscurity because they lacked the scale or dramatic clarity that historians and popular audiences demanded. The great irony was that while the strategic narrative of Normandy was one of Allied success and German defeat, the tactical reality was far more complex, filled with German defensive successes like Keller's that delayed and disrupted Allied operations, even as they ultimately failed to prevent the broader advance. But complexity and nuance do not make for compelling narratives, and so the story of Thomas Keller and his farm-built shield remained unknown except to the handful of men who witnessed it and the families of the Americans who died in that pasture. In 2003, an American veteran named Robert Morrison, son of Private First Class James Morrison, killed at the farm in 1944, traveled to Normandy as part of a tour group visiting D-Day sites. He had his father's final letter, written the day before he died, and a photograph of his father in uniform, and he wanted to see the place where his father had fallen. Using coordinates from unit records and modern maps, he found the location, now a prosperous dairy farm with modern buildings and paved roads, nothing remaining of the stone walls or destroyed farmhouse. The owner, a Frenchman who had purchased the property in the 1970s, knew nothing of its history beyond vague stories about fighting during the war. Morrison stood in the pasture where his father had died and tried to imagine what had happened, but 59 years had erased all physical evidence, and the pastoral scene of grazing cows and neat fences bore no relationship to the violence that had occurred there. He took photographs, said a prayer, and left, having found a place but not understanding, location but not meaning. He never learned about Thomas Keller or the MG-42 or the Shield, never knew that his father had been killed by a single desperate soldier rather than in some larger chaotic battle. The specificity of that knowledge might have made the loss easier to bear, might have provided a narrative that made sense of random death, or it might have made it worse, harder to accept that his father had died because one German soldier had improvised better armor and held his ground. Morrison died in 2011 without ever knowing the full story of his father's death, taking his questions with him. The broader lesson of Keller's stand, if there is one beyond the obvious truth that survival often depends on improvisation and luck, is that war at the individual level is radically different from war at the strategic level, that the clean narratives of campaigns and offensives dissolve into chaos and contingency when examined at close range. Keller did not hold the farm because of German tactical superiority or better equipment or ideological commitment. He held it because he improvised a solution to a specific problem, because he ignored doctrine when doctrine was inadequate, because he was willing to violate regulations in service of survival. The shield worked not because it was well designed by engineers, but because it was adequate for the specific threat Keller faced, because quarter-inch steel at 30 degrees was enough to deflect .30 caliber rounds at 120 meters, even if it would have failed against different ammunition or different angles or different circumstances. The MG-42 performed extraordinarily, not because Keller was a master gunner, but because the weapon was designed with enough tolerance and durability to function even when abused far beyond its specifications. The 27 casualties were the result of firepower and position, and the Americans' misfortune in approaching across open ground against a weapon with a 1,200 round per minute cyclic rate. Every element of the engagement was contingent, dependent on specific circumstances that could have been different in 1,000 ways, and had any one element changed, the outcome would have changed completely. Keller understood this, which is why he never spoke of the engagement as an achievement or victory, but simply as something that had happened, a data point in a war full of data points, significant to the people involved, but ultimately just one more small tragedy in a conflict that produced tragedies on an industrial scale. By the time Keller died in 1989, the Cold War was ending, and Germany was reunifying, and the Second World War was transitioning from living memory to history, the province of scholars and documentarians rather than participants. The men who had fought in Normandy were in their 70s and 80s, their numbers diminishing each year, their stories increasingly filtered through the lens of official histories and cultural memory rather than direct testimony. Keller's story died with him because he had never told it in detail, had never written a memoir or given interviews or participated in the post-war culture of commemoration and remembrance. He had simply lived his life, worked as a machinist in a factory in Munich, raised his children, maintained his silence about the war except when pressed, and even then offering only the barest facts. His daughter, sorting through his effects after his death, found the Iron Cross and the discharge papers, and a handful of photographs, but no diary, no letters, no written record that explained what any of it meant. She knew he had been wounded, could see the scar on his thigh when he wore shorts in summer, but he had never explained how he received it beyond a vague reference to combat in France. The gap between what had happened and what was remembered, between the lived experience of 6 minutes of sustained violence and the handful of fragmentary records that survived, was absolute and unbridgeable. Yet the story persists in fragments, recorded in unit histories and casualty reports, and the fading memories of the few men who survived the engagement and spoke of it to family or historians before they died. Fischer, the corporal who had commanded the squad after Richter's death, survived the war, and in the 1970s gave an interview to a German military historian researching defensive tactics in Normandy. He described Keller's defense in brief terms. One of our privates, Keller, held them with an MG-42 and some improvised armor he had built from farm scrap, killed or wounded about 24 of them before we had to evacuate. I had never seen anything like it. The historian included the anecdote in a footnote in an academic book that sold perhaps 2,000 copies and was never translated into English, ensuring that the story remained obscure even within the specialized community of military history scholars. Zimmermann, another survivor, mentioned the engagement in a letter to his son in 1983, writing, "There was one time when Keller held off an entire American company by himself. They laughed at his shield, but it saved his life and maybe ours too." The letter survived in family archives, but was never published or shared beyond immediate family. These fragments, scattered across decades and sources, are all that remain of an engagement that was, in its moment, absolutely central to the lives of the men involved and absolutely peripheral to the broader historical narrative. This is the nature of war, the vast majority of it unrecorded and unremembered, known only to the participants and lost when they die. For every famous battle with its monuments and museums and commemorative ceremonies, there are 10,000 small engagements like Keller's defense, tactically significant but strategically trivial, producing casualties and trauma and stories that vanish into archival obscurity. The men who died in that pasture deserved better, deserved to have their deaths mean something beyond casualty statistics, deserved to be remembered as individuals rather than numbers. Thomas Keller deserved better, deserved recognition for his ingenuity and courage, deserved to have his story told as an example of human resourcefulness under impossible pressure. But war does not provide what people deserve. It simply provides outcomes, some of which are recorded and most of which are forgotten, and the living are left to piece together meaning from fragments and silences. The farm still stands, produces milk and cheese. the ground still fertilized by the trace elements of men who died 80 years ago. Visitors drive past on the modern road without knowing what happened there, without understanding that the peaceful pastoral scene was once a killing ground, where 27 men fell in 6 minutes. This is as it should be, perhaps. The living have a right to live without being haunted by the dead. But the dead also have a right to be remembered, to have their stories told, to exist as more than statistics in unit histories and names on memorials. This is why we tell these stories, why we search archives and interview survivors and piece together narratives from fragments, not to glorify war or celebrate violence, but to honor the individuals who lived through it, who made impossible decisions under unimaginable pressure, who survived or did not survive but deserve to be remembered either way. If this story moved you, if you believe that the forgotten heroes of history deserve to be remembered and honored, then help us keep their memories alive by engaging with this content. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or your own family stories from the war. Like this video to help it reach others who value these untold histories. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story of courage, ingenuity, and the human cost of conflict. Every interaction, every share, every comment helps ensure that men like Thomas Keller and the American soldiers who fell in that pasture are not forgotten, that their stories continue to be told, that the lessons of their experiences remain available to future generations. These are not just historical curiosities. They are human stories, reminders of what ordinary people are capable of when pushed to extremes, testaments to resilience and resourcefulness and the terrible price of war. By engaging with this content, you become part of the community that keeps these memories alive, that refuses to let the passage of time erase the individuals who lived through history's greatest conflicts. So take a moment now to like, comment, and subscribe. Help us honor the forgotten, remember the lost, and tell the stories that deserve to be told.